There is a house on Long Island that now has appeared, depending on how you count this, somewhere between 40 and 60 horror movies. Not 40 films about the house, and there's 40 something films named after the house. Films that have almost nothing to do with each other. Films made by completely different people, for completely different studios, and completely different plots. Films with titles like Amityville Vibrator, Amityville in Space, and I wish I was making this one up, Amityville's Christmas Vacation. Admittedly, that's not the worst one of them. And somehow, every single one of them shares the name with one of the most legitimately disturbing true crime cases in American history. That is a mouthful. How does something like this happen? How does a real murder house, a place where 6 people were shot to death in their sleep, turn into a brand so free and open that literally anybody with any budget and any idea can just slap the name onto a movie and call it done? Well, pull up a pew, because this is one of the strangest stories in horror cinema, and it starts long before any camera even rolled. Starting on a night in November 1974, with a 23-year-old man walking into a bar in Long Island who told everybody that he'd just shot his parents. The town of Amityville, New York, sits on the south shore of Long Island, about 30 miles from Manhattan. I'm not trying to sell a house to you, this isn't me selling a house. In the early 1970s, it was exactly what it looks like. A quiet, comfortable suburb. Nice house, nice family, the kind of place that nothing ever happened in. 112 Ocean Avenue was one of the nicer houses on the street. 3 stories tall, sitting right on the water. This is where the DeFeo family lived. Ronald Sr., his wife Louise, and their 5 children. From the outside, they had everything. A beautiful home, a boat. Behind closed doors, it was a completely different story. Ronald DeFeo Sr. was, by most accounts, an overbearing, violent man. A car dealership manager controlled his family with a kind of oppressive heaviness. His eldest son, Ronald Jr., known to everybody as Butch, which isn't a name anymore, had gone clashing with him constantly. It's pretty normal in families, to be honest with you, especially if you're very similar. By his early 20s, Butch was drinking heavily, using drugs and getting into fights. He was not, by any measures, a sensible young man, unlike Muggins here. On the night of November 13th, 1974, while his parents and 4 siblings slept, Butch DeFeo picked up a 35mm caliber Marlin rifle. These all sound like foreign words to me, because they are. And he went room by room through the house. This is what I've came back to, by the way. This is what I've decided to talk about the first time coming back to YouTube. He killed his father first. That one kind of feels very logical. Then his mother, then his 18-year-old sister, Dawn, then 13-year-old Allison, 12-year-old Mark, and finally 9-year-old John Matthew. All 6 people found face down in their beds, hands over their head, apparently undisturbed. The neighbours heard nothing. There was no sign of struggling whatsoever. Whatever happened in that house that night happened in near silence. I don't know about guns, but I'm sure they go boom, boom, boom. Butch then got showered, got dressed, disposed of any of the evidence, and went out. Several hours later, he walked into Henry's bar, told the regulars that something had happened at his home. A group of them gathered up and went back, not with pitchforks, but just in general. That's when they called the police. And by that time, investigators arrived. They found one of the most chilling crime scenes Long Island had ever seen. Butch was initially treated as a witness, but within 24 hours, he had confessed. His defense at the trial was voices. Voices in the house, which had compelled him to do it. The jury did not believe it, and neither do I. He was convicted on 6 accounts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. He died in prison not too long ago, in 2021, still having changed his story multiple times over the years, and still had never fully explained what had actually happened. The DeFeo murders were and remain a genuine tragedy. 6 people killed in their beds by their own family member. It was the largest mass killing in Long Island's recent memory. If the story had ended there, in Ocean Avenue, it would be a sad footnote in a true crime book. But that's not the end, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. Like 10 minutes in, might be 5. Because 13 months later, after the murder, a new family moved in, the Lutzes. George and Kathy Lutz were young, newly married, and looking for a home for their growing blended family. When they found 112 Ocean Avenue on the market, they knew exactly what had happened there. They moved in anyway.
Just moving into the house was fine. It's a lovely house. Yeah.
It was a 6-bedroom house with a heated pool, a boathouse, and going for $80,000, which is just nowadays insane. Like, that's just snap it up, which is obviously even at the time below market value, for obvious reasons. They moved in December 18th, 1975, just before Christmas. What came out in 1975? What was a good toy? I don't know. I'll put it on the screen now.
$6 Million Man.
They had left by January 14th, 1976. 28 days they had lasted. What they claim to have happened in them 28 days has been argued about ever since. Green slime oozing from the walls.
More of a gelatin kind of substance.
Swarms of flies in the dead of winter.
You're talking about how many? over 100
Over
flies
100
at
flies.
once.
A priest coming to bless the house
Communicate with the priest, we would run into faulty connections.
and being told by a voice, in a very clear, very direct voice, get out.
He thought it might be caused by anxiety.
I don't know if that's like a thing. I've never never had my house blessed. I don't know if that, it seems to be like an American thing, but it might be just a movie thing. George woke up pretty much every night at 3:15 in the morning, just so you don't. It's not 3:15 in the afternoon. He's not a massive napper. Every single night he did this, which was reportedly around about the original times of the murder. The small girl had developed an imaginary friend, which is not uncommon, but they were seeing eyes in the darkness, rocking chairs moving on their own, a bit like Evil Dead. They left their house, leaving most of their belongings, and they never went back. Now, obviously, the question is any of this true? And this is where it kind of gets a bit more strange. Not supernatural strange, but human being strange, which is most of the time arguably worse. Arguably? In 1979, the DeFeo's own defense attorney, William Weber, gave an interview to People magazine and said, and I got to be really precise with this, the exact wording is important, that he and the Lutzes had created the horror story together to, quote, over many bottles of wine. Weber had initially approached the Lutzes about collaborating on a book deal that might support a new trial for his client. When that arrangement fell apart over money, he walked away and then told the press exactly how the sausage in this case was made. I've seen how sausages are made. It's disgusting. The Lutzes would obviously deny this and maintained until their death that these experiences were real. They took polygraph tests.
And we both passed with flying colours.
Which came out showing no deception. That's true. Double negative sometimes. Father Piccaro, the priest who allegedly blessed the house, later said that his only contact with the Lutzes about the matter had been over the telephone, never in person. Other investigators found over 100 factual errors in the accounts. Where the recordings contradicted specific claims, the police log showed that the Lutzes never once called the police during the 28 days of the supposed supernatural torment. The family who bought the house after the Lutzes, who lived there 10 years, reported no other problems whatsoever.
And they said they'd had no problems whatsoever. Everything was just fine. And they implied that this is all a big hoax.
The only complaint was the number of tourists and ghost shows showing up outside their home, which I would be annoyed by as well. What probably happened is that a family in some sort of financial difficulty, struggling to keep the heating on and the water running, which some people do actually believe they left during, got tangled up with a lawyer looking for a book deal. Told some stories. I wouldn't want to be a lawyer, to be honest with you. Like, when I think about it, I don't want to be a lawyer either, because it sounds awful. I would hate to be a lawyer. I'd want to be a book writer if I was a lawyer. They told some stories, embellished those stories, and then found themselves too committed to a bit. They're too committed to the bit to just walk back on it. But they did walk into something far larger than they anticipated. Because in 1972, in September, a book came out. J. Anson was a writer who had previously made a short documentary about the production of The Exorcist. He was introduced to the Lutzes by a publishing editor at Prentice Hall, and he spent months listening to around 45 hours of tape-recorded recollections that the Lutz had submitted. He did not meet them in person during the writing process. He simply listened to tapes and wrote, which, if you've ever been an archiver, it feels like the exact same job. As somebody who's done archiving at one point, same job. He'd also recently had a heart attack shortly after taking the job, which again sounds like an archiver. He wrote most of the books on drugs during his 3-month recovery period. I presume he's on drugs because you take at least beta blockers and stuff like that. He worked for about 4 or 5 hours a day, turning roughly 2 chapters a week. The resulting book was the Amityville Horror, a True Story, in quotation marks. A slim, punching book, about 65,000 words, told in flat, stripped-back prose, almost no adjectives. Short chapters, it reads, in the words of one of the contemporary critics, more like a police report than a novel, and the subtitle, A True Story, was doing most of the heavy lifting at that point. The book hit the New York Times bestseller list almost immediately, overnight. It went through 13 hardcover printings in the first 6 months, and it eventually sold somewhere in the region of 10 million copies. People believed it largely because it was presented as a document of real-life events by a person who had vouched for its authenticity. The tagline on early editions called it more hideously frightening than The Exorcist, because it had actually happened. The lawsuit started almost before the ink was dry. The Lutzes sued Weber, Weber sued the Lutzes, next-door neighbours sued everybody because ghost hunters kept trampling through their gardens and smashing their begonias.
They're marigolds!
A police officer mentioned in the book sued the publisher.
I think she's right. They are marigolds.
It became, as one publishing executive put it at the time, an industry where half the Western world was getting sued. But none of that mattered to Hollywood. Bring on Hollywood! Da 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 da! In 1978, American International Pictures, the EIP, acquired the rights to the Anderson book for over $200,000. EIP was a legendary independent studio. It's even the middle name of it. American Independent Productions, I think. This company made its money and its name producing cheap exploitation films throughout the 50s and 60s, then graduating into increasingly ambitious productions in the 70s. By 78, it was in financial trouble, trying to compete with the major studios and spending way beyond its means. Amityville Horror was initially going to be a television movie. Anson wrote the screenplay himself. When EIP head Samuel Z. Arkoff, sounds like a fake name to me, rejected it. Screenwriter Sander Stern reworked it into a theatrical release. Stuart Rosenberg, the director of Cool Hand Luke, was brought in to helm the movie. They shot exteriors in Tom River, New Jersey, at a rented Dutch colonial house that bore a resemblance to 112 Ocean Avenue. The production paid $12,000 for the lease and built a boathouse on the side. Interiors were shot at MGM Studios in Culver City. In MGM Studios, Culver City, the entire budget was around $5 million, which is shit all now. James Brolin played George Lutz, Margaret Kidder played Kathy, Rod Steiger, an Academy Award-winning, played the belligerent priest. The studio hyped the production's supposedly strange on-set occurrences, following the playbook that worked so well for The Exorcist, though James Brolin later admitted that he and Kidder essentially just looked for things to tell journalists and couldn't really find anything bad going on. The film opened on July the 27th, 1979, far before I was born, and critics were largely unkind. Janet Maslin at the New York Times called it a collective of repetitive gimmicks. God, that's hard to say. And at least one reviewer simply called it a rip-off, which is kind of fitting for EIP, to be honest with you. Audiences, on the other hand, disagreed entirely. Amityville grossed $7.8 million in its opening weekend, across fewer than 800 theatres. By the end of its theatrical run, it had made $86.4 million at the North American box office, nearly 20 times its budget, and it was the second highest grossing movie in 1979, behind Kramer vs. Kramer, which has nothing to do with Seinfeld, which I didn't find out until the end of the movie. It held the record for the highest grossing independent film of all time until 1990, when TMNT, which feels wrong to say it's an independent movie, came along and somehow did more business. Think about it for 2 seconds. A haunted house film, critically dismissed, largely contested, based on a story that's own principles later described as an invention, became one of the biggest films of the year.
It's a lovely house. Yeah.
Stephen King, in his 1981 book Danse Macabre, offered perhaps the most interesting analysis of why. He called the film a parable about economic anxiety. The Lutzes were a family who were stretched themselves to buy a house they couldn't quite afford. At the time when American mortgage rates were hitting 9% and inflation was 18%. This is all very boring, incredibly dry, I'm so sorry. The horror of the Amityville Horror was just a demonic presence. It was the terror of losing your home, of the American dream curdling, of discovering the walls of your investments bleeding. In this case, literally. Green sludge, apparently. Whether or not you buy that reading, the box office numbers are unambiguous. The film's connected with something. And so, the sequels began. Amityville 2, The Possession, arrived in 1982, produced by Italian schlockmeister Dino De Laurentiis. Because this film was technically a prequel telling a heavily fictionalized version of the DeFeo murders, they renamed the family the Montellis. They added possession, incest, a rubber monster effect. By most accounts, a more viscerally alarming film than the original. It is not exactly a more respectable one. Then came Amityville 3D in 1983, which arrived exactly when you'd expect it, during America's brief and doomed love affair with the three-dimensional gimmick at theatres. A skeptical journalist moves into the house to debunk the story. Things go bad. Windows glow ominously. Them TV hosts that review everything on TV delivered what could be the perfect verdict for this. You know you're in trouble when all you can think of is to praise the windows of the house. After 3 theatrical releases, the franchise ran out of obvious room. The real Amityville house had been blown up at the end of 3D, which presented a geographical problem. The solution that filmmakers landed on is generally one of the most bizarre creative decisions in the history of horror sequels. They decided that the evil didn't live in the house. The evil lived in the stuff that was in the house. And its pieces of furniture got sold at yard sale, shipped to California, and the evil came with it. Amityville 4, The Evil Escapes, aired on NBC in 1989 as a television movie. The haunted object was a floor lamp, specifically a standard brass floor lamp that moves through a house in a way that somehow is threatening. A possessed chainsaw shows up, a garbage disposal goes rogue. It is without question a film about a murderous lamp from Amityville. The screenwriter of this one, incidentally, was Sander Stern, the same man who had written or rewritten the original 1979 film. In interviews conducted years later, he mentioned that he had no idea more sequels had been made after this, which tells you something about the level of communication that happens with these sort of franchises. From there, the possessed object formula became a template. Haunted clocks in Amityville It's About Time, 1992. A haunted mirror in Amityville New Generation, that's 1993. And in 1996, Amityville Dollhouse, which is where a miniature replica of the original house is found during a renovation and given to a girl because, of course it is. These films were all direct-to-video, and that's the only reason I know about them. They were cheap, the connections to the original story were tissue-thin, but they kept getting made because the name still moved units on video store shelves. Horror fans would pick up a box that said Amityville, take it home, and sometimes be pleased, which is a vague term, and most of the time not. Occasionally, they put it back in the wrong section. By 1996, the series went quiet for nearly a decade. Then in 2005, MG, which by that time owned all the rights to the original trilogy, released a remake of the Amityville Horror starring Ryan Reynolds and Melissa George. This is during the peak of remakes right now. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Ring, Dawn of the Dead, The Ring, not just Ring, had all recently proved that repackaging classic horrors for a new generation could be very profitable. The Amityville remake made $109 million worldwide. It was genuinely a success, even though I don't remember it being so. And then nothing happened. No sequels, no franchises. The remake just sort of stood there having made its money and faded away. I think it's available to watch on YouTube. George Lutz, the actual George Lutz, publicly called it drivel, which feels like a very British term, suing the filmmakers for defamation and a breach of contract. He died of heart disease in 2006. Kathy Lutz had died 2 years earlier than that. For 5 years after the remake, the Amityville name largely stood dormant in cinemas. Then in 2011, a company called The Asylum, best known for producing low-budget mockbusters with titles like Snakes on a Train and Transmorphers, released something called Amityville Haunted. They're the guys that they make films that almost seem similar, so your nan gets them slightly wrong. That is, Asylum is sort of the guys who open the floodgate on a lot of these things. To understand what happened next, you need to understand one rather important piece of intellectual property law. You cannot copyright a real place. This is the films that set that rule. You cannot copyright real events. The murder at 112 Ocean Avenue happened. They are part of public records. The house exists. The town of Amityville is a real town. People go there all over YouTube. It's in New York, which was called Amityville long before any of this happened, and will be called Amityville long after these films are forgotten. This simply means everybody can make a horror film that references the DeFeo murders, set in a story in Amityville, in New York, or feature a haunted house with certain windows, as long as they're not lifted directly from J. Anson's specific narrative about the Lutz family. This legal reality was formally established in a 1989 court case, Lutz versus De Laurentiis, in which George Lutz sued, because he loves suing people, the producers of Amityville 2 and Amityville 3D for diminishing the value of his story. The ruling was very clear. The DeFeo murders and their supernatural legacy were matters of wide public record, covering extensively by the newspaper, television, books, and obviously real documentaries. None of the fake documentaries, like the mermaid ones. The public didn't primarily associate Amityville with the Lutz family and the J. Anson novels. In fact, I think doubly so, not the J. Anson novels. They associated it with the murders, which is something nobody can own. The courts actually said this directly, that the Lutzes couldn't claim to be, and I'm paraphrasing here, but barely, the property of owners of secondary associated results from the publicly aground a murder that somebody else had committed. Jesus Christ. And that's even me paraphrasing it. So you cannot sue a filmmaker for calling something Amityville whatever, as long as you've not specifically adapted the Anson's book without a license. In the early 2010s, several things collided. The Asylum, well-published appetite for cheap genre content, the explosion of digital distributors making it easier than ever to put a film in front of audiences without a theatrical release, and a renewed public interest in the Amityville name, thanks to, in part, The Conjuring 2 from 2026. Nope, 2016, I will get that right. Which set several scenes in the original house and briefly made the whole mythology feel relevant again. The results of this were somewhat resembling a gold rush. Between 2011 and the present day, dozens of films have been produced carrying the Amityville name. Most of them have nothing to do with each other. But many of them essentially have nothing to do with the original story. Their connections only by a word that costs nothing to use, that signals haunted house horror to a certain audience that bumps up the discoverability on streaming platforms when somebody types Amityville in the search bar. The title tells the story more effectively than any description could. Amityville in the Hood, Amityville Vampire, Amityville Scarecrow, Amityville Cult, Amityville Poltergeist, Witches of Amityville, Amityville Cop, Witches of Amityville Academy, Amityville in Space, Amityville Christmas Vacation, which generally I believe represents the end point of something that I couldn't tell you exactly what. There is even a film called Amityville Gas Chamber, which is described as a parody of all the other low-budget Amityvilles, which means you have now reached the point where Amityville franchise is parodying itself. The horror critics at Paste magazine noted rather beautifully that the weirder the premise, the less anybody has to worry about being sued, because Amityville Bigfoot is so far removed from specific narratives of J. Anson's book that no court in the land is going to consider it an infringement. The 2017 film Amityville The Awakening, produced by Blumhouse, somehow, is the closest thing to a prestige entry in the era. It made $742 at the United States box office, not $742,000. It's $7,000. I keep saying 7,000. It's $742. As a reference point, the average monthly rent in Amityville is somewhat more than that. You couldn't pay your rent with that movie. So who exactly is watching these movies? This is a genuine question I've asked myself, and haunts me more than I would like to admit. The original film made $86 million. The 2005 remake made $109 million, and then Amityville Awakening made $742. That's it. The gulf between them numbers represents something interesting. The brand name still attaches some search engine clicks, but it is no longer guaranteed as an audience to mean anything. The people actually watching these direct-to-video releases are largely dedicated horror completionists, the kind of viewer who finds it perversely satisfying in sitting through a generally bad movie. That's me again. These are the people who will watch Amityville Vibrator despite knowing it will be terrible. That's me. There is a whole subculture of horror fandom built around this exact activity, and it is not a small part of it. There is also something to be said about the discovery of algorithms. If you watch the 1979 movie on a streaming platform and then the 2005 remake, the recommendation engine starts suggesting things called the Amityville Haunting or Amityville Asylum, and suddenly you're 2 hours into something that costs less to make than your monthly grocery bill, and you're not entirely sure how you got here. This is not hypothetical. This happens to people constantly. I do it on Tubi about once a week. The economics make a strange kind of sense once you look at them. A film with Amityville in the title has made hundreds of thousands of dollars or less, released on digital platforms, will find enough of an audience, curious horror fans, algorithm refugees, people who sat through Amityville 3D in 1983 and feel some loyalty to the concept. They will turn a profit. Not a large profit, but a profit nevertheless. So they'll just simply get made. As of 2026, there are reportedly new Amityville horrors developing at Amazon MGM Studios with an actual director attached, but the wheel will continue to turn. Here are some things that Amityville stories that do keep coming back. At its centre, something generally awful. 6 people, including 4 children, murdered in their beds by their own brother. A family that was, by all accounts, of people who knew them. Not a happy family, a household defined by control, conflicted, and violence. They built up over the years until it came to that final terrible night. That's the real Amityville horror. Not the glowing windows, not the possessed light, not the clocks that bent time or dollhouses that released demons. Whatever is going on in Amityville in Space, I didn't actually watch that one. The real horror that happened is a 23-year-old man going into a room in the dark with a rifle. The Lutz family, whatever the truth of their experience is, turned that real horror into a commercial venture. J. Anson turned that commercial venture into a best-selling book. Hollywood turned that book into a cultural institution, and then because an accident of geography, because the murder house happened to be in a real town with an uncopyrightable name, the cultural institute became free for all, a brand without an owner, a haunted house that anybody could move into.